Subcommittee will come to order. I ask unanimous consent the chair be authorized to declare recesses during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. I'm sitting in for Chair Maloney today, who is otherwise detained, and I want to say good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's hearing on commercial and passenger vessel safety. As we approach the anniversaries of important maritime safety legislation, we need to know the Coast Guard. We need to know that Coast Guard inspected vessels will be reliably safe, sound, and operable, especially in light of recent maritime casualties. Over the past 19 years, we have seen a string of maritime casualties here in the United States, from the catastrophic Conception dive boat fire that cost the lives of 33 passengers and one crew member, to the capsizing of the Golden Ray in Georgia and countless other vehicles. The past years have provided a continuous list of maritime casualties that is too long and tragic. And I share my deepest condolences to the families of victims of these maritime tragedies. It's our responsibility as Congress to prioritize the lives and safety of crew and passengers over profits. This hearing is needed to evaluate the oversight of commercial and passenger vehicles and identify what is working and what needs improvement. The U.S. has a history of taking a reactionary approach to safety, creating maritime safety laws that follow tragedy rather than preemptively strengthening safety requirements for a more robust fleet, one that is effectively regulated and inspected. Just this last week, the LA Times described a contentious relationship between the Coast Guard and the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB. Coast Guard's repeated failure to embrace and act on the NTSB's recommendations on passenger vessels has emerged as a persistent thread in recent maritime casualties. Recommendations from prior casualties continue to resurface in later accidents, and yet the Coast Guard refuses to act. And I share the NTSB's concerns. Recent accidents on small passenger vessels demonstrate that poor preventive maintenance, lax fire prevention, and inadequate crew training all continue as contributing factors leading to calamity. The Coast Guard is making a critical mistake by not acting more assertively on these recommendations. Moreover, the grandfathering of passenger vessels under the old T regulations emphasize these concerns. Revisions to Subchapter T regulations for passenger vessels in 1994 were intended to create safer vessels, yet by grandfathering in older vessels, passenger vessel safety has been compromised by keeping older, less safe vessels in service far longer than desired. All of this could lead to additional and more deadly accidents in the future. Last year, Congress passed the Ham Alert Maritime Safety Act of 2018 in wake of the sinking of the cargo vessel El Faro. This legislation focused on the Coast Guard's inspection program and oversight of recognized organizations. It also highlights the importance of safety management systems, or SMSs, on all vessels to prepare them for emergency scenarios. 1 year later, I expect to hear from the Coast Guard and the American Bureau of Shipping on the concrete action steps they've taken to implement the Act. Cruise vessels as well pose unique risks and vulnerabilities for passengers, as safety on the high seas not only applies to the physical maintenance of the vessel, but to how passengers are taken care of while at sea. When massive cruise ships embark, should I stop this statement? When massive cruise ships embark, they're essentially floating cities. They have their own security and oversee thousands of individuals with high exposure to risk. In 2010, nearly a decade ago, Congress passed the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act to provide U.S. citizens more protections while vacationing on cruise ships. It was last amended in 2012 and has not been revisited since. In this environment, the chances of crime, especially sexual assault, are high and the resources available to victims scant. I look forward to hearing from Admiral Salerno on what the industry has done to implement the Act. From cruise ships to cargo ships, from large ferries to small passenger vessels, one constant remains true. Oversight of safety measures is vital to protecting lives and property. It's a government and industry's responsibility to provide a safe and reliable maritime industry, and it's the work of this committee to do its oversight to make that happen so everyone who steps on a vessel safely reaches the end of their voyage. Before continuing, I ask unanimous consent to insert statements from Congresswoman Matsui, the International Cruise Victims, and a paper from the International Organization of Master Mates and Pilots into the hearing record. Without objection, so ordered. And now I would call on Ranking Member of the Subcommittee, Mr. Gibbs, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. Last Sunday marked the 44th anniversary of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald in Lake Superior, made famous in the modern-day folk song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The entire crew of 29 was lost, so it's appropriate that we hold this hearing on maritime safety this week. Sadly, we've had 3 significant marine casualties in the U.S. flag vessel in the last 4 years, on which nearly 90 lives were lost. The Alfaro, the Missouri Duck Boat, and most recently, the Conception. In response to the Commandant of the Coast Guard Alfaro accident final action memo, Congress adopted the HAM Alert Maritime Safety Act to assure the recommendations in that memo were implemented. The subcommittee looks forward to receiving the final action memo on the Conception tragedy when it is complete. Today's witnesses will discuss changes made in the years since Congress passed the HAM Maritime Alert Act and in the near decade since Congress passed the Cruise Vessel Safety and Security Act of 2010. We will also examine the dramatically expanded Coast Guard maritime safety workload and how to service its and coping with that increased workload. In 2004, Congress brought ferries under the Coast Guard inspection. In 2006, Congress brought towing vessels under inspection regime, though that regime is only now being implemented. Finally, in 2010, Congress established a new examination and classification requirements for fishing vessels. Having brought nearly 75,000 vessels under additional security, the Coast Guard has received virtually no additional resources to carry out its marine safety work. This has led to increased use of third-party inspections. I look forward to hearing today what the actions have been taken to ensure that the Coast Guard has sufficient authority to oversee this increased use of third-party inspectors and to maintain its own in-house expertise. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing today. I look forward to the witness' testimony, and I yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and I apologize to the panel for arriving late. We're dealing with some extraordinary circumstances that probably need no explanation, but you probably also realize that between Chairman DeFazio and Chairman Larson, you have 2 gentlemen who have forgotten more about these issues than I am likely to ever learn. So you're in very capable hands. And with that, I would be happy to recognize the chairman for any remarks he might wish to make.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. You know, the most important function of this committee is to ensure that all of the modes which are under our jurisdiction are as safe as is humanly possible. And as people know, we've been pretty much submerged, I guess, wrong metaphor, but anyway, we've been working, you know, a lot on aviation with the MAX fatalities, but you know that doesn't mean that we aren't concerned about other modes in surface. We have, you know, fatalities increasing, pedestrian and cycling, and et cetera. But here we are today to talk about maritime issues. You know, in my vice chair's district, Salud Cabral, the Conception disaster happened, and for the life of me, I live on a boat. This is the 3rd boat I've lived on, and you know, I always had you know, there's always another exit, and I guess in this case both exits were blocked. I don't know how that happened. We don't have everything definitive from Ntsb. We had the fishing boat burning and sinking off Barbers Point, Hawaii, and then the capsized and unsalvageable Ro-Ro off of St. Simons, Georgia. So I think it's very appropriate that we're here today to you know, revisit some of these issues. Some might remember the hearing we held on Alfaro a few years ago. You know, 33 people died in that disaster. And you know, we held follow-up and oversight hearings, and we felt that we had to legislate because the Coast Guard had allowed its marine safety branch to essentially atrophy, and we were depending upon classification societies and others. And I've always had concerns about the classification societies because, hey, come inspect my ship. Oh, wait a minute, you found all those problems. I'm going to hire someone else next time to inspect the ship who might overlook those problems. I think there's an inherent conflict of interest there. I'm not 100% certain how we could solve that, except from this committee's perspective, you know, much more expertise and oversight by the Coast Guard of those classification societies, and check up actual inspections to see that they were conducted properly is really very critical. So we're going to talk today about the HAM alert reforms that we adopted, and we want a status update from the Admiral on that. I also want to learn if the cruise industry has fully complied with the requirements adopted in 2010 with the Passenger Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act. It's a very lucrative industry, and they can well afford to implement all of the provisions of that law. So, there's an old saying, all Coast Guard safety regulations are written in blood, as each new regulation reflects lessons learned from the latest marine disaster. What we want to do is get ahead of these issues as much as we humanly can. The sea is a difficult place, and accidents are still going to happen, but we want to avoid any that are preventable. With that, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and I thank him for his leadership on issues of safety in this context and so many others. Has a career dedicated to safety, first and foremost. And I'm pleased to welcome our witnesses today. I do want to express my thanks for your appearance. I'm glad you got to hear my opening remarks. I want to thank Mr. Larson for doing that. I don't want my absence to be interpreted as a lack of concern for these issues. I think the work that you do in this space and the attention we're paying to it is critically important. So again, thank you for being here. Happy to introduce our panel. We are blessed to be joined by Rear Admiral Richard Timmy, Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy for the United States Coast Guard, the Honorable Richard Balzano, Deputy Administrator for the United States Maritime Administration, and Mr. Brian Curtis of the Office of Marine Safety for the National Transportation Safety Board. Thank you again for your appearances. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. Since that written testimony is in the record, would request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes so we may proceed with members' questions. And with that, I'm pleased to recognize Admiral Timmy. You may proceed, sir.
Good afternoon, Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss U.S. passenger vessel fleet and the Coast Guard's role in advancing a safe, secure, and environmentally responsible U.S. maritime industry. I ask that my written testimony be entered into the record. First, let me express our sincere condolences on the passing of Congressman Elijah Cummings, former chairman of this subcommittee and staunch supporter of the Coast Guard. Without question, his conviction, passion, and public service made us a better Coast Guard. The U.S. maritime transportation system supports $5.4 trillion in economic activity and more than 30 million jobs. As the Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy, I set standards for safety, security, environmental stewardship, commercial vessels, facilities, mariners, and ensure the compliance with those standards and conduct investigations into violations and accidents across the system. On behalf of the Coast Guard, I would once again express our deepest sympathies to the families and loved ones of those who have perished in recent marine casualties. These tragedies are at the forefront of our minds as we strive to enhance the marine safety program. As I begin my role in this job, my priorities include reviewing the marine safety regulatory and policy framework, modernizing our marine safety workforce, and leveraging and ensuring an effective oversight of third parties. We are working closely with the National Transportation Safety Board to determine the cause of recent casualties and identify improvements to strengthen the framework and ultimately prevent future incidents. However, we are not waiting for final investigations to implement urgent and necessary safety action. The Vessel Compliance Program is a systemic safety net designed to prevent accidents from occurring. All elements of that framework are interdependent and must function well for the system to work. The Coast Guard provides a critical, mandated level of oversight and is responsible for verifying U.S. flag vessels comply with applicable laws and regulations, and for foreign vessels, the Coast Guard conducts examinations to ensure each vessel is in substantial compliance with international convention. Equally important, a vessel's master and crew play essential roles and should be the first to recognize problems and take early corrective action. The vessel owner is obligated to support the master and crew's ability to maintain the vessel and operate it safely, And additionally, classification societies, recognized organizations, or third parties should provide an expertise to ensure vessel systems are operating properly, and that the company and crew are fulfilling their roles in the safety net. All elements of this framework must be functioning well in the system. This is a challenge given the current U.S. inspected passenger fleet is technologically and operationally diverse. There are over 6,300 U.S. inspected passenger vessels, including large inland river cruise ships, high-speed catamarans, large amphibious vessels, long-distance sport fishers, to name a few. Vessels in this fleet operate in diverse environments, from the Bering Sea to Great Lakes, to the Pacific, to the Atlantic, to the Gulf Coast. They may carry as few as 7 passengers or as many as 1,000 and operate on a journey of a few minutes or many days. The U.S. fleet carries more than 200 million passengers annually. The cruise ship industry, comprised mostly of foreign vessels, adds to the fleet, and these vessels carry more than 14 million passengers annually, making almost 10,500 arrivals at U.S. ports each year. The Coast Guard must have an adaptive and proficient marine safety workforce capable of operating in this complex environment. And we must continue to work effectively to implement marine inspector learning systems and put oversight regimes in place that enable industry to safely embrace technology and the advances in vessel design and operations, as well as emerging passenger and crew demands. To this end, the Coast Guard will strive to continuously improve. We will get better. We will closely examine findings of all marine casualty investigations to improve that framework. We will wholly fulfill our regulatory oversight role to keep the maritime public safe. We take our responsibility to protect and safeguard those traveling aboard foreign and domestic passenger vessels seriously. It's my priority, and I will keep you informed as we move forward. Again, thank you for your enduring support of the Coast Guard, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Belzano.
Good afternoon, Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Maloney, and Ranking Member Gibbs, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the Maritime Administration, MARAD's, role in promoting the safety and security of the U.S.-flagged commercial fleet. I request that my full written testimony be submitted in the record. Secretary Chow's #1 priority is safety, and that focus extends to MARAD's programs. The maritime environment is remote, dangerous, and repetitive, which can increase the risk of accidents. MARAD plays an important role in educating and training U.S. mariners to face the challenges and hazards of living and working at sea. At MARAD, we believe a well-trained mariner is a safer mariner. MARAD educates and trains U.S. merchant mariners at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy and supports the 6 state maritime academies and the Seafarers International Union, all which adhere to the U.S. Coast Guard and international training requirements. At the academies, deck and engineering cadets must complete training and assessments required to obtain a U.S. Coast Guard unlimited license as a third mate or third assistant engineer. These training courses and assessment take place during the Academy's 4-year curricula, which include classroom and hands-on shipboard training. U.S. Merchant Marine Academy cadets spend 1 year working and learning at sea on commercial U.S. flagged vessels. Building on knowledge from the classroom, this hands-on experience solidifies the best working and safest practices on board commercial vessels. Cadets at the state maritime academies receive most of their at-sea training aboard MARAD-provided training vessels. I'd like to thank the Congress for funding 2 new modern training ships. The National Security Multi-Mission Vessel, which is currently in procurement, will greatly enhance our training capability. Additionally, MARAD supports DoD strategic sea lift requirements through our government-owned Ready Reserve Force fleet and assured access to commercial vessels in the Maritime Security Program. As a fleet owner and operator, MARAD is committed to staying abreast of maritime industry safety and security trends, incorporating lessons learned from the real-world incidents. Security is another major concern for MARAD and the maritime industry. MARAD provides U.S.-flagged vessels with timely information on security threats through interagency coordinated maritime alerts and advisories. Moreover, DOT ensures proper and accurate reporting of incidents occurring on cruise vessels by collecting the data directly from the FBI and publishing it on our department website. Safety and security regulations do not always keep pace with technology and practices. As a result, national and international industry standards often fill the gap. MARAD collaborates with the U.S. Coast Guard, the maritime industry, and technology developers to develop industry standards that guide equipment requirements and usage. Merit is currently working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration on a project to install automated weather stations on U.S. flagged ships to improve weather forecasting and warning and provide for greater vessel operational safety. Pairing this system with other onboard global positioning systems, GPS, may also assist in detecting GPS interference, which is a growing cybersecurity threat. The U.S. Maritime Workforce is a critical component of our nation's economic and national security. Recognizing this, Marriott is looking at advances in remote operations to help to reduce the risk to mariners. Marriott recently partnered with industry to demonstrate remote operations of a spill response vessel that can help minimize mariner exposure to toxic and explosive environments responding to a hazardous spill. Marriott is exploring additional applications of data-driven systems, particularly in enhancing shipboard and port operations optimization. Marriott looks forward to continued collaboration with our federal partners in the maritime industry to improve vessel safety and security. I appreciate this subcommittee's interest and support of the U.S. Merchant Marine, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Curtis.
Good afternoon, Chairman DeFazio, Chairman Maloney, Ranking Member Gibbs, and subcommittee members. Thank you for inviting the National Transportation Safety Board to discuss marine safety today. I request my written testimony be admitted into the record. The NTSB investigates accidents in all modes of transportation, determines their probable cause, and issues safety recommendations to prevent future accidents. Today we'll focus on two topics: small passenger vessel safety and the importance of safety management systems, or SMS, on passenger vessels. On July 19, 2018, the World War II-era amphibious passenger vessel Stretch Duck 7 sank during a storm near Branson, Missouri, resulting in 17 fatalities. We continue to investigate this accident in parallel, but separate from the U.S. Attorney's criminal investigation. We have identified two safety issues we have seen before: insufficient reserve buoyancy, leaving these vessels vulnerable to rapid flooding and sinking, and impediments to passenger vessel emergency egress. We saw these same two issues 20 years ago in the 1999 sinking of the Miss Majestic, another amphibious passenger vessel that claimed 13 lives. Survivors from that accident confirmed that the vessel sank less than a minute after the deck edge submerged, leaving little opportunity for passengers to escape. Further, the vessel's canopy impeded their ability to safely egress from the vessel. We recommended at the time that the Coast Guard require greater stability and reserve buoyancy in amphibious passenger vessels. Until that was done, we urged the Coast Guard to require canopies be removed during waterborne operations, or that such vessels install a Coast Guard-approved canopy that does not restrict passenger escape. After the Coast Guard did not require our recommended improvements, we classified those recommendations as closed, unacceptable action. Now we know that insufficient reserve buoyancy and a canopy that impeded the passenger's ability to escape served to worsen the tragic death toll when the Stretch Duck 7 sank last year. Accordingly, yesterday, the board issued two new safety recommendations. We again call on the Coast Guard to require sufficient reserve buoyancy and the removal of canopies from those amphibious vessels that do not have sufficient reserve buoyancy. These known safety issues should no longer go unaddressed or be left to voluntary compliance. On another front, late last year, we completed our investigation of the fire aboard the small passenger vessel Island Lady near Port Richey, Florida. One passenger died and 14 others were hospitalized. During the voyage, the captain encountered an engine alarm. Rather than shut the engine down, he left it idling, allowing it to continue to generate heat, which in turn ignited the exhaust system and surrounding structures, eventually consuming the vessel. Although federal regulations require small passenger vessels to have fire detection and suppression systems in the engine rooms, the regulations do not require such systems in unoccupied spaces outside the engine room, which is where we determined the fire started. A recommendation to the Coast Guard has been issued related to this very matter. The NTSB has long advocated to the Coast Guard that all passenger vessels should implement a safety management system, a comprehensive, documented system ensuring oversight of all vessel and shoreside operational safety aspects. An SMS is essential for enhancing safety on board passenger vessels, and the NTSB feels the Coast Guard should ensure such systems are required. In the case I just described, an SMS would likely have ensured greater adherence to completing crew training drills, ensuring appropriate responses to emergencies, and improved record-keeping of training and maintenance, which is required of ocean-going vessels in international service. Finally, on September 2nd of this year, the dive boat Conception caught fire and sank near Santa Cruz Island, California, with a loss of 33 passengers and 1 crew member. Our investigators continue to gather information and review current regulations for vessels of this age, type, and operation, specifically regarding fire detection and alarm systems, evacuation routes, and crew training. The deadly loss of the Conception, just feet from shore, should remind the small passenger vessel industry that the potential for catastrophe is always present. The loss of the Island Lady reminds us that an SMS and robust preventive maintenance systems are necessary to improve the safety of any marine enterprise. Our investigation findings and recommendations represent lessons learned at the highest price. Action on NTSB recommendations provides a return in lives saved, injuries prevented, and property loss and environmental damage avoided. Thank you for your time today. I would be pleased to take any questions you might have.
Thank the gentlemen for their statements. We will now proceed to members' questions. Observing the 5-minute rule, begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Admiral Timmy, you heard in my opening statement some of the concerns raised by the Los Angeles Times recently. I want to give you an opportunity to correct anything you think I said through my colleague, Mr. Larson, that might have been unfair or incorrect. And I'd love to get the thoughts of the NTSB. I think you understand the issue. You understand the issue is whether we are sufficiently implementing recommendations of the NTSB, and if not, why not? Want to give you an opportunity to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Conception fire is a tragedy, and upon learning of it, we dispatched our lead marine investigator, the head of our investigation shop, to go out there, and he was there the next day along with NTSB to begin looking at the circumstances. And as alluded to, that investigation continues. One of the things that we also did was to start charter a small passenger vessel task force internally, as well as direct a concentrated inspection campaign on all vessels of that type carrying overnight passengers across the country. That happened immediately after. I've asked my team to take the results of that when they're complete, as well as the NTSB recommendations, and we need to look at that framework now and reevaluate post what we learned from this short-term look, as well as the long-term Marine Board of Investigation, but relook at, including NTSB's recommendations, what to do with our small passenger framework.
Mr. Cruz, you have anything to add to that? It's not required, but I want to give you an opportunity to comment.
I would say we look forward to the implementation of our recommendations. Some of these have been outstanding for an extended period of time, and those more recent ones we feel are critical to the safety of passenger vessels. So we look forward to working with the Coast Guard on these recommendations to get these implemented.
Admiral, what can you tell us about the, can you give us an update on the Coast Guard's assistance in developing MOB standards with the IMO?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The MOB standards are man overboard standards as part of the Cruise Ship Security Vessel Act. We are working with IMO and the International Standards Organization, and together have created a standard, a draft standard for the MOB. We worked through that international process to come to an official standard that we hope to adopt into the rulemaking, adopt and make the standard. So we are looking forward to that within the next year to be able to then promulgate the rule.
So what is your time frame for promulgating a rule?
I would say we're looking at the next 12 months as work with the International Standards Organization and that body to approve it and then incorporate it.
And how long have we been working on the rule?
Sir, we have been working on it since its passage, 2010 and 12, and then immediately put into action 11 of the 15 self-executing and have been working with industry and cruise ships to make sure that was in place. But this is an outstanding piece that we need to continue to work.
We look forward to that being completed, sir. I want to yield balance my time. Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Chairman. Admiral, since 2004, the Congress enacted legislation to bring ferries and towing vessels under inspection, require examination classification for fishing vessels, and increase the safety requirements on, as you know, on cruise vessels. The question is, has the Coast Guard been able to keep up with these increased statutory requirements in terms of, I've got 3 points here. The first point would be services budget and the number of personnel needed. And I guess I could just go through and we go with it. Expertise, able to cover the breadth of the U.S. flag fleet from our old steamships, which rely on to meet our military sea lift needs, and the new state-of-the-art vessels that are just coming into service. And the third would be the service's ability to effectively oversee the Army of the third inspectors now doing much of the day-to-day inspection work. So for those 3 points, you know, what's the status?
Thank you, Congressman. So to your point about the ability of resources and expertise to take on the challenges that you've outlined, it is in fact a challenge for us, and we have to divide among our lines of effort the ability to address each of those problems or each of those challenges. For instance, the expertise issue, STEAM, we've created a new STEAM course in working with our partners, and that was part of, I believe, the HAM Safety Act as well. We also have gone into the modernization of our marine inspections workforce with a program that will baseline how we train this workforce. The expertise in that workforce is critical to being able to handle the capacity of demand that you mentioned. So we have put resources into that this year in a 2-year program that will conclude next year with new training, new delivery methods, blended training, both online and in person, that is more in keeping with modern education for our workforce. We have to look at risk-basing our framework. We will have to prioritize our limited, finite resources to the highest risk. We continue to do that in all our fleets, and we need to develop that in the small passenger vessel fleet as well. And third parties is the other portion you mentioned. We have continued to develop that for Subchapter M, the towing vessel fleet, as a crucial piece to handle the nearly 6,000 vessels that are added through that, but really to revamp it post El Faro and HAM Safety Act, revamp our relationship with recognized organizations who act on our behalf and inject a discipline into that so that they, when acting on our behalf, are carrying out our desires with regards to the framework. And so we've worked hard with our partners to one, published a framework on our interpretation of the International Safety Management Code to set a baseline for the third parties to look at, and then to make a more robust relationship from the port level where our inspectors work with the surveyors of DNV and ABS and the rest of the, up to leadership level.
Okay, thank you. I want to get on this next question. I'm running out of time. But on September 12th, the Coast Guard's Great Lakes Pilot Advisory Committee unanimously agreed to recommend that in April of each year, they meet with the Coast Guard and the stakeholders to really facilitate the rating, what the rates will be for the pilots. The Coast Guard, do you tend to work with this committee that unanimously made this recommendation to work together to figure out what the rates should be for the fees?
Congressman, the Federal Advisory Committee for the Great Lakes is absolutely one of the valuable advisory committees that we take in order to perform our job across all the missions. We've had a great 3 years working with GLIBPAC, or the Great Lakes Advisory Committee, on rate setting. There are challenges to that, and we make sure that we are transparent and sit down with that committee, and we're happy to continue to sit with them as we go through that framework to set the rates.
Yeah, I would think it should be an open process and work together, facilitate that. During the inspection requirements, Admiral, Subchapter T vessels subject to the post-96 regulations, those grandfather small passenger vessels subject to pre-96 regulations. Will the Coast Guard casualty investigation look at whether this application of post-96 regulations might have changed the outcome of the passengers aboard the Conception accident?
Congressman, that's exactly what this Marine Board of Investigation is tasked at looking at. All the pieces, the framework that are involved, from the construction standard you mentioned, to the operation of the crew and the owner, to the maintenance post-certification of a Coast Guard inspection. If the investigation comes back and points to the pre-96 standard as a causal factor, we will react to that in post with policy and/or rule.
Thank you. Amount of time yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Also, in my absence, I know we expressed our condolences and concern for the victims of the Conception tragedy. I know we're also pleased to be joined by Representative Salud Carbajal, who represents the district in which that tragedy occurred. We thank the gentleman for his appearance today. I know he has been in the forefront of efforts to respond to that appropriately, and we look forward to his questioning on today's panel. At this time, I'd like to recognize Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Chairman Maloney. Admiral Tim, in the recent past, we know the Coast Guard has placed an increased emphasis on combating illegal charters in light of multiple fatalities and other significant safety concerns from commercial passenger vessels. For example, one tragic casualty occurred near St. Petersburg, Florida, from the vessel Jaguar in 2017, where a crew member unsuccessfully attempted to rescue a fatigued passenger in the water during rough weather, which resulted in both men losing their lives. And we understand that there's an active criminal investigation going on at this time. But can you describe the importance of crew training and man overboard drills?
Thank you, Congressman. Absolutely, you point to critical factors in this framework for passenger vessel safety. Not only the certification of the construction of the vessel that carries passengers, but the training of the captain and crew who are responsible for their safety. That would require for any passenger, in a paying passenger, 6-pack and above, 7 and above, that's a Coast Guard license of a certain level, and 6-pack and below, that's also another license that is insured first aid training, basic seamanship, things designed to keep the person in charge from making decisions that put their passengers at risk, like going into an area and making a swim call in conditions that were not warranted. We have worked hard with outreach and education across the country, particularly in the pockets where illegal charters are more common, to make sure that this is addressed, and work with the U.S. attorneys to prosecute in those areas. This last weekend in Fort Myer, a public outreach campaign of a Coast Guard station with a local television crew was out doing the outreach and actually did termination of a illegal charter. So those are the steps we're out there doing to address that.
I have a question also to follow up, and maybe you've answered it, but just to be clear, is crew training required on uninspected, not inspected, but uninspected passenger vessels?
Congressman, on an uninspected passenger vessel, the only crew that would be required would be the captain.
That's the only training, would be
And
the
the captain would receive the basic training that went with that uninspected passenger vessel license, basic seamanship, first aid.
So you're saying that a commercial passenger vessel, besides the captain, has no requirement to have crew training in emergency situations?
Congressman, to your question, and happy to take specifics on this, but when we talk about 6-pack and below, 6 passengers and below, that's the way I took your question. If I took that wrong, I'll correct that. But for 6 and below, it's just the captain. To a regular T-boat, what we call the small passenger vessel fleet, there is indeed training for the captain, but the crew may or may not, a deckhand may or may not be trained and licensed.
So there's no requirement.
Correct.
So could the Coast Guard provide us with investigation statistics regarding crew training on uninspected and inspected passenger vessels?
Congressman, I'll take that for the record, absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Can you give us, I appreciate your testimony highlighting the increasing cybersecurity risk to our maritime transportation system and the Coast Guard's efforts to establish a cybersecurity standards for passenger vessels operations with NIST. Can you give us an update on these efforts? When can we expect the framework or the standards to be completed?
Congressman, we address cyber across many parts of the marine transportation system. We've worked with IMO since 2016 to create an international standard for assessment of risks. And then 1 year later, we led the effort at IMO internationally to require cyber be addressed in safety management systems for ships. Here, we work at the area level or the port level to ensure every port will do an assessment of cyber risks in the port. Below the port level, we get to the facilities. The facilities themselves will be required, not required, but advised through policy to work off of a National Institutes of Standards framework. At least that's what a draft of our current guidance showed. We will then bring that down to the vessel level as well, where we recommend that industry begin to lead themselves to compliance with cyber standards of hygiene and assessment. This is where the risk lies for them.
Got it. I thank you, Admiral, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Admiral, Mr. Balzano, Mr. Curtis, for sharing the information that you have with each of us. I want to talk about safety, but from a little bit different perspective, and I believe this question will be directed towards Mr. Curtis. I think you're the most suited to answer this, but I open this up to any of you that feel you could answer this. I want to talk about markers, aids to navigation specifically, that we put out there to hopefully allow for mariners to navigate safely and navigate in times of reduced visibility. Now, I was prompted to ask this question because my community was recently rocked when a mother and a 1-year-old child were on a vessel that struck a navigational beacon in a time of reduced visibility, and they were killed. And so that's what prompts this line of questioning. I'm trying to understand what is the rationale that exists for why there may be a day beacon used or a light used, or if a can or a nun has a light on it, or whether bridge markers or pilings, other aids to navigations, whether they're marked in a lit fashion or not, and specifically looking at Florida where this occurred, inland waterways and intercoastal waterways, maybe to be more specific.
Thank you for the question, sir. I'm not familiar with that accident. We have done some accidents involving aids to navigation, very few, not recently. I don't want to throw it over, but maybe the Admiral may be better suited to answer your question, sir.
Congressman, thank you for the question. So there's a couple different ways when you look at a port area that we will seek to establish what aids to navigation are appropriate for that. We'll do either a waterway assessment, which is typically from our navigation office here at headquarters working with local stakeholders. And that is done on a rotating basis in port areas to look at what new needs might be arising from the waterway for aids to navigation. The other one is a port and waterway safety assessment, again, done locally by the captain of the port or the OCMI, that office there, working with stakeholders like pilots, harbor safety committees, industry, recreational groups, to look at traffic and what type of aids to navigation would be appropriate there to change that. There is a process to change it if they would need to be updated.
Can you discuss a little bit further in the time remaining the process to upgrade and change?
I'm sorry, sir, I missed the first part.
Could you discuss in the time remaining the process to go out there and upgrade and change some of these aids to navigation to make them be in a lit fashion?
Yes, sir. So the overall process, and I was able to do one of these in Tampa Bay around 2002. It's a multi-day workshop process that would start with invitations to the stakeholders. And again, this is the big process. An individual who wanted to petition for a change could come directly to Coast Guard headquarters or the local common board. But the larger process is a transparent one where we bring in particularly the Pilots Association, the Harbor Safety Committee, local industry. Recreational boaters is typically important. Port authorities that deal with what vessels are coming in, and so because that's important to the characteristics of turning basins and other aids to navigation. So over a 2 or 3 day workshop, they'll do a risk assessment, they'll score it, they'll rank it, and they'll make a recommendation at the end in a report that will go to Coast Guard headquarters. And then my Office of Navigation will look at that and update typically in the next aids to navigation cycle what would go there. Floating aids are much easier than fixed aids. Fixed aids are a little more resource intensive, and particularly larger aids like ranges. Range lights would be particularly challenging to do in a quick budget cycle.
Very good. Thank you, I appreciate it. And Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you for your presence here today and your commitment to improving waterway safety. I wanted to ask you, Admiral, a question or two about the Towing Safety Advisory Committee. As you know, that's the Federal Advisory Committee for Towing and Industry Safety. Apparently, it's been brought to my attention by some of my constituents who have been actively involved or engaged with the work of the committee that the Coast Guard was unable to secure the Department of Homeland Security's reapproval of the committee's charter prior to its expiration in early July. The Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2018 reauthorized the Tow and Safety Advisory Committee under a new name, the National Towing Safety Advisory Committee. So my question is, essentially, what is the status of reconstituting or establishing this newer iteration of the Towing Safety Advisory Committee? Do you anticipate that members that were currently serving on that committee are being considered and perhaps may serve on this newly constituted committee?
Congressman, we have clarified with congressional staff, the committee staff, our take on that direction from the Authorization Act. We intend to keep the committees in place as is through their intended expiration in the end of 2020. So we'll reconstitute as is the current membership, current charter, as we work on renewing all the federal advisory committees in accordance with congressional intent, so that they are redone under their new names, new charters at the end of next year. That's when membership may change if we resolicit for membership, but I'm happy to follow up on any membership issues with you.
And then just to clarify, as a follow-up, so during the period that we're in right now, are you continuing to formally solicit input from the existing members of the Towing Safety Committee, Advisory Safety Committee?
That is my intent, to use the existing committee members as the advisory to the framework. But again, there are often many opportunities for different stakeholders that would be on that committee to bring input to the Coast Guard. But as constituted, we'll take that membership advice.
Right, and again, all this is just clarification. I know that the Tow and Safety Advisory Committee works on several tasks, and so this task work, does that continue today?
That's correct, Congressman. It should be.
Great. Okay, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Now I'd like to recognize Mr. Gallagher for 5 minutes of questioning or shaving, whichever he prefers.
Wow. That was a low blow, Mr. Chairman.
I'm not sure all the products available in Wisconsin, so I just want to give the gentleman every opportunity.
It's called a hunting beard, so So to follow up on the questioning about the Towing Safety Advisory Committee, which I believe provided recommendations to the Coast Guard in 2015 on the improvement of marine casualty reporting. The 2016 Coast Guard Reauthorization Act required the Coast Guard to provide a report to Congress on the actions the agency would take to implement its recommendations. A lot of my constituents believe that the report shows that the Coast Guard has not gone far enough in implementation. They believe that the Coast Guard's vast amount of marine casualty data should be systematized so that the maritime community can better use it to improve commercial and passenger vessel safety. So I guess the question I would have, Admiral, is how is the Coast Guard addressing the challenge of making marine casualty reporting data more valuable and more available to the maritime community in order to improve maritime safety?
Thank you, Congressman. I concur. We need to make the data we have more valuable, not just to the maritime community, but to the Coast Guard itself, as we seek to modernize our IT systems and our data systems. And that's one of the priorities the Commandant has, to make sure that we have a 21st century information technology backbone. In 2015, when that guidance went out with regards to marine casualties, we saw a significant drop in reporting of the casualty reporting the next year. I point that out because it did, in fact, clarify for those stakeholders you're talking about where and when they had to report, much to their satisfaction. That's what had been advised. So we saw a real change in the reporting. The challenge now becomes, as you point out, modernizing that data for use, both internally and externally. We do keep the data that we do have available on the Port State Information Exchange on casualties and investigations for the public, and we unfortunately would be at a FOIA request for other data at this point.
Okay. And then you have a great team in my district of Coast Guardsmen who do great outreach to the community, but there's some concern I hear about sort of big Coast Guard or Coast Guard staff in DC who have an intersection with a lot of the regulatory aspects. Is there a way to sort of plug them in to the Great Lakes region and have more feedback and interaction? I guess less of a question, but more of whether you'd be amenable to a follow-up conversation with me and my staff on how we can improve that communication and find a way to sort of satisfy some of the concerns that my constituents have.
Congressman, I look forward to that conversation.
Fantastic. And Mr. Chairman, I just would say, on behalf of people with beards everywhere, I will not be silenced.
The gentleman yield. I'm going to recommend he just let it go. As someone who's got hair challenges, I should probably not be speaking. Appreciate the gentleman's indulgence. With that, I'm going to recommend Ms. Plaskett.
Thank you. And I have a petition started for Mr. Gallagher called Keep the Beard, so long as we get to go hunting with you.
Who said bipartisanship was dead? No, proceed.
Admiral, I wanted to ask you about passenger vessels. In the Virgin Islands, passenger vessels play a really important role in part of our local economy, and safety is a very important issue. I've heard concern from constituents about the issue of illegal vessels, illegal charters specifically. Companies come down without business license and don't have the right certification. Licensed charters are in competition with these vessels, which may have safety gear issues. They may have the safety gear, but not certification to be operating with dozens of passengers. I realize this is a problem nationally in light of multiple fatalities and other safety concerns from commercial passenger vessels. Can you provide us with an update on the Coast Guard's efforts and strategy to combat these illegal charters?
Congresswoman, the Virgin Islands is one of those places as an island that's absolutely dependent on that waterway. I ran the Coast Guard detachment in St. Croix from 1997 to 1999, and very familiar with the unique aspects of the passenger vessel there. We are looking at outreach, education, and partnership as the approach, and enforcement as the approach to illegal charters around the country. We have sought to educate the public with regards to what they should look for when renting a vessel, including a licensed captain and a certificated vessel if it's above 6 people. We've done outreach at the port level by walking the docks, posting signs. We have worked with local news crews to highlight the problem. And then lastly, we have not partnered, but gone to the U.S. Attorney where appropriate for egregious violations of the laws with regards to charters and passenger vessels. It disadvantages those you just pointed out, those who legitimately take the time to certificate their vessels, to do the training that's expected to carry passenger vessels in this country, and that's a disadvantage for them. So we continue to attack it.
Are there additional resources, or do you feel that you have sufficient manpower and resources on the ground to get that done?
We, like all our mission sets, we prioritize for mission accomplishment with the finite resources we do have. We meet mission with those resources, but additional resources always go to more optimal solution sets.
Great. One of the other things I wanted to talk with you about in terms of this travel and is survival craft regulations. When vessels sailing internationally are generally required to carry out-of-water survival craft. This was intended for vessels like cruise ships, large deep draft vessels, oil rigs, etc. I know that in the past there's been an exemption to subchapter 11 where the conditions of the voyage would render specific requirements unreasonable, unnecessary. You know, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, there's a lot of international voyage to the British Virgin Islands, and in some places that's a span of less than 5 miles. We do understand that it's pretty treacherous water in between there. Numerous operators in the district have, requested subchapter W exemptions due to the unreasonable cost for such voyage in warm weather. What is the Coast Guard's commitment to operating this in a very fair, risk-based, and at the same time keeping safety in mind?
Thank you, Congresswoman. From your question, you can see the intricacies that go into the different variables for making a decision with regards to life-saving on certain vessels, route, amounts of passengers, the conditions. And so the best tool we have is local knowledge. It's the local officer in charge of marine inspection, in this case out of San Juan, Puerto Rico, or the detachments in St. Croix and in St. Thomas, that would be most familiar with the routes, most familiar with the vessels, and most familiar with what would be appropriate. I'm happy to get back to you on the record or follow up with you on any particular vessels.
I appreciate that. And Deputy Administrator Balzano, before my time runs out, under the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010, information on whom to contact in the event of a crime is required to be posted and easily accessible to victims when the FBI is doing investigations by a cruise vessel. How do victims receive this information? Where is it posted? And what has MARAD done to help standardize training of crews on evidence and crime scene preservation?
Well, ma'am, that's a good question, but a lot of that falls into the Coast Guard's area of responsibility. MARAD's responsibility is to collect the data of FBI incidents and report that on the department's website. Additionally, the other role that we have with that act is that we provide voluntary certification of companies who do training to cruise vessel security programs. And that's the only 2 roles we have, ma'am.
Thank the gentlelady. It's my understanding that Mr. Young would like to yield his time to Mr. Gibbs. Gentleman is recognized.
Yeah, Admiral, the answer you gave regarding the Safety Advisory Committee is actually in contrary to the answers the Coast Guard has provided the subcommittee previously. And regarding the advisory committees, whose members have been told the committees are in abeyance, I just have a request that the Coast Guard provide to the subcommittee a briefing on this issue as soon as possible.
Congressman, we'll follow up you at your convenience.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Carbajal is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On September 2nd, we tragically lost 34 lives when the Conception dive boat caught on fire at 3:14 a.m. off the coast of my district in California. This was the worst maritime disaster in 70 years. My condolences go out to the families of those victims. Let me say that I'm very grateful to the Coast Guard for their help in the search and rescue operations, and to the NTSB for their continued investigation into what went wrong. And while I want to recognize the Coast Guard men and women for just doing a heroic job day in and day out on their mission, and I have a number of Coast Guard service members in my district that do an outstanding job, I must say that when you look at the track record of implementing the NTSB's recommendations, it is not a good track record. And since over the years we've seen tragedy after tragedy after tragedy happen, and the Coast Guard has a track record of inaction. While it is my understanding the NTSB is still conducting their investigation, I am disturbed by some of the reporting following this tragedy. Admiral Timmy, I'm particularly concerned by the fact that the NTSB has continuously, for many years, advocated for the Coast Guard to implement procedures to conducting regular inspections, reporting maintenance needs for all of the boats, systems, and crew training. Yet the Coast Guard has ignored many of these recommendations. What actions has the Coast Guard taken to make sure those recommendations are implemented? And why have they not been implemented to date?
Congressman, the Conception fire is absolute a tragedy, and our hearts go out to the family of the victims. And we look forward to a full and complete investigation with the Maritime Board of Investigation. To your question with regards to the NTSB's recommendations, we work with them side by side on the investigations we do. And when we come to a recommendation, the NTSB makes a recommendation in the framework of a protocol to make a safety recommendation. We would have to take that recommendation into a different framework, into the framework of not just the recommendation itself, but the rulemaking, the guidance, the workforce, and the ecosystem it would go into. In this particular case, after the conception, I've chartered a team to look at immediately, without waiting for the Marine Board of Investigation, but immediately to look at that class of vessels after a 30-day inspection campaign on those type of vessels, come back, look at what we found without waiting for the full MBI, and make recommendations to me regarding their findings and what needs to change in the safety framework, including rules and policy around these passenger vessels. And that includes re-looking at the National Transportation Safety Board's recommendations with regard to that. And I look forward to doing that.
Thank you. It's been brought to my attention that the Conception was working under old T, quote unquote, old T safety requirements, meaning they were not following the most up-to-date safety rules. What are some of the safety implications to continue to operate under this framework? And why do we need to wait until another tragedy to change our current safety rules?
Congressman, the old subchapter T and new subchapter T both have many vessels in the fleet that operate under those construction standards. They are valid construction standards today, as long as the vessels continue to be maintained in accordance with as constructed under that regime. To your question, we do not have to wait moving forward to look at what needs to change in that subchapter. In fact, that team I referenced will look at that, including if the Marine Board of Investigation finds that there was a point that had to do with the old construction standard, we will absolutely look at that.
Thank you. Mr. Curtis, do you care to add to that?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. Certainly, we've issued recommendations in the past in these areas. Particular to the Conception, we're going to take a close look in this investigation at subchapter T, as the Admiral alluded to, not just for the existing and the old T, new T, but whether even the new T is adequate, whether it, as it addresses means of escape, crew responsibilities and the likes of that. So certainly, this is a tragedy, and we're taking a close look at all these regulations, a fresh look at old subchapter T, new subchapter T, just for the validity of that very subchapter to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
Thank you very much to both of you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We'll now proceed to the second panel. Thank you all. Oh, pardon me, forgive me. We have one more member who has not had an opportunity to question. Forgive me, Ms. Miller is recognized, and at that time, we'll proceed to the second panel. Thank you. And we've been joined by Ms. Carson. Forgive me, we will have two more members of Congress do their questioning, and then we'll proceed to the second panel. Forgive me. The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Although my district in southern West Virginia may be far from the coast, maritime transportation is essential for my district that exports the natural resources and manufactured products that power this country and the world. It is so important that we protect the mariners that go out on our rivers, lakes, and seas while making sure that our industry can remain competitive in international commerce and trade. Rear Admiral Timmy, how has the domestic commercial shipping industry taken on the responsibility to ensure that their vessels are safe for their mariners and communities?
Congressman, I see the evidence of the attention of the fleet to the safety and security of their cargoes, passengers, and the environment through many stakeholder frameworks that we have. Not just the fact that they comply with the regulations that we put on them. They come to the advisory committees that we've referenced here today. The federal advisory committees are full of the marine professionals you talk about who are there to advise the Coast Guard and other regulating bodies about how to do the job better. They participate at the local level with the harbor safety committees in each port on the rivers. In Huntington, West Virginia, I think is the nearest harbor safety committee you're going to have there, where that local industry, particularly the chemical and oil industry, given the refining capability there, works closely with the Coast Guard to ensure that that communication to achieve a joint goal of safe and secure maritime system is achieved.
What are the biggest challenges that the Coast Guard faces when it comes to ensuring that vessels are in compliance with the federal regulations and international standards?
Looking ahead, we see emerging technologies that will challenge the inspection regime and the inspection workforce. We're looking at new means of propulsion with liquefied natural gas as both as a fuel. We're looking at dynamically positioning ships in the offshore. We're looking at the incorporation of technology into bridges of ships that we hadn't seen or envisioned 30 years ago. This challenges both the industry and the Coast Guard to keep pace.
Thank you. Admiral Balzano, what steps have the Maritime Administration taken to work with industry stakeholders to improve safety in passenger and commercial safety?
Well, ma'am, we, as the Admiral mentioned, we host many different industry days. We cooperate and coordinate with the Coast Guard, the maritime industry, and our federal partners as well. We don't have any enforcement or regulatory responsibility for safety, so we try to take all the lessons learned so we can apply those to our own fleets that we operate, and that's the extent of our responsibility.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Now I would like to recognize Representative Carson.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member Gibbs, for holding this very important hearing and for allowing me to join the subcommittee today. Although I'm not assigned to this subcommittee, maritime safety is very important to my constituents, especially the Coleman family members who survived the duck boat tragedy in Branson, Missouri last year. Director Curtis, I was very pleased to see in your testimony, sir, recommendations for duck boats to have sufficient buoyancy so that they remain upright and afloat with passengers in the event of damage or flooding.
NTSB also recommended the removal of canopies for vessels without sufficient buoyancy. I've introduced legislation H.R. 2799, which would require implementation of these recommendations and a number of other recommendations made previously after other tugboat fatalities. Sir, do you believe the changes you have recommended can prevent future fatalities like the tragedy in Branson?
Thank you for your question, sir. Well, certainly, those two recommendations that you spoke about, there were put out new recommendations yesterday. The intent there is when these duck boats, historically, when they go down, once they submerge, they sink very quickly. So the intent of the recommendation, A, is to have reserve buoyancy, so when they do get to the water level with the passengers on board, they will remain at the water level to enhance the ability of the passengers to egress. But additionally, if they do not have the reserve buoyancy, we would like to see the canopies removed and the hardware over them. So the challenge has been when these vessels sink that the passengers become entrapped, they sink quickly and they're trapped inside. So that's the intent of those two recommendations, to, if they ever do encounter problems and take on water, they'll stay at least at the water line to allow them responders to help, as well as keep the vessel on the surface.
Is there more action that the committee should consider, including maybe enforcement of existing requirements?
Well, certainly we appreciate the endorsement of these safety recommendations to get them implemented. These were made originally very close to the same language 20 years ago. We think they're critical to the survivability. Vessels can always take on water, but it's really about survivability, keeping them on the surface and not being encumbered by the canopies. So certainly we feel these two recommendations are critical, and we really urge the implementation of these by the Coast Guard.
Yes, sir. Thank you all. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Just immediate. Is there any other questions? Having none, I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony and for answering questions today. It's been very insightful and helpful. Thank you so much. We will now move on to the second panel. Good afternoon. I would like now to welcome our next panel of witnesses. We have a number of individuals. First, we have Vice Admiral Brian Salerno, Senior Vice President of Maritime Policy for the Cruise Line International Association. We also have Mr. Adam W. Moylanen, did I say that right? Vice President of Health, Safety, Quality, and Environment for the American Bureau of Shipping. We have Mr. Aaron Smith, President and CEO for the Offshore Marine Service Association. We have Ms. Colleen Stevens, Vice President of the Passenger Vessel Association, and Mr. Paul Sturpkow, did I get that right? President of the Louisiana Association for Justice. I have a hard name to pronounce too, so I sympathize. Thank you to all of you for being here. I look forward to your testimony. In attendance, I want to recognize Representative Young, who wants to make an introduction of one of his constituents who happens to be here on the panel today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would just make one comment ahead of time. I've been involved with the Coast Guard now for 60 years, And if we want to solve some of the problems asked the Coast Guard, we have to start funding them better than we've been doing in the past. That's one of our biggest challenges. We give them responsibilities, and yet we don't give them the money to do the job. But my pleasure now, Mr. Chairman, is to welcome my fellow Alaskan, Colleen Stevens, to the Transportation Infrastructure Committee. Colleen Stevens is the president of her family's business, Stan Stevens Glacier and Wildlife Cruises, and the national vice president of the Passenger Vessel Association. Stan Stevens Cruises has been in operation 48 years, same length I've been in Congress, and operates two 149-passenger sightseeing vessels in Prince William Sound, carrying 18,000 persons per year. Her company embodies the great maritime tradition we have in Alaska. I understand Colleen joined the family business at a very early age and worked her way up through all aspects of the company to her present role. I'm proud to know that Alaskans here to serve the voice of the U.S. flagged passenger vessel industry, which is very important to the state of Alaska. We in Alaska know how vital this industry is to the state, and in the future in Alaska and nationally is predicted and continuous improvement of safety. I appreciate all the work that you and your colleagues have done at the Coast Guard Committee to ensure the safety of your passengers, and I look forward to the testimony that we can do better. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Representative Young. Again, thank you for being here today. I look forward to your testimony. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. As with the previous panels, since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes each. With that, we will start with Admiral Salerno. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gibbs, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. It is an honor to appear before you as a representative of the Cruise Lines International Association, or CLIA, to discuss passenger vessel safety. CLIA is the world's largest cruise industry trade association and includes among its membership approximately 95% of the global cruise capacity. This year, our members anticipate carrying 30 million passengers on their 272 ships. Half of all passengers will sail from ports in the United States, which remains the largest cruise market globally. The number of passengers carried has grown by approximately 1 million per year over the last decade, as ships have likewise grown in complexity and capability. The safety and security of our passengers is of paramount importance. These are the fundamentals, without which our industry could not succeed. It is what our guests and our crew members rightly expect, and thanks to sustained efforts by our members, objective data shows that cruising is indeed among the safest vacation experiences available anywhere. According to renowned maritime industry analyst and researcher G.P. Wild, the cruise industry has expanded its capacity by 55% over a 10-year period from 2009 to 2018. Meanwhile, the rate of operational incidents has declined by 35%. The kinds of incidents analyzed includes fires, groundings, collisions, loss of propulsion, and persons going overboard. These positive trends did not occur by chance. They result from an industry making a concerted effort to operate safely and with due regard for the safety and comfort of its guests. 9 years ago, Congress passed the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act, which raised the bar on passenger safety and security. CLIA supported that legislation. At that time, this subcommittee was under the leadership of Chairman Elijah Cummings, who, as you all know, was a passionate advocate for maritime safety and for seafarers. We note with sadness his recent passing. His legacy endures, however. We're pleased to report that the industry has embraced the requirements contained in the CVSSA and has made them part of standard operating procedures. Railing heights and stateroom security measures are built into our membership ships. Medical facilities and trained providers are available in the event of a medical emergency. And although crimes remain rare events, when they do occur, trained security personnel preserve evidence and coordinate with shoreside law enforcement. Crimes involving U.S. passengers are reported to the FBI and the Coast Guard, and quarterly crime statistics are published online by the Department of Transportation. As for the rate of crime, noted criminologist Dr. James Fox of Northeastern University has compared reported incidents on cruise ships to the National FBI Crime Statistics, the Uniform Crime Reporting Program, and concluded that major crimes on cruise ships occur at significantly lower rates as compared to those occurring on land. Safety is central to the operation of our cruise ships. However, our commitment to maritime safety is not limited to our own ships. Most of our members are active participants in AMVER, the Automated Mutual Assistance Vessel Rescue System. Through the AMVER system, our members make their vessels available to rescue coordination centers around the world to respond when needed to aid mariners in distress. Although this means itinerary disruptions and delays, cruise ships typically respond without hesitation when called upon, often placing their own crew members at risk to save others. Each year, cruise ships are recognized for their life-saving efforts by the AMVER program, and here in the capital by the Association for Rescue at Sea. Equally important to our industry is environmental stewardship. Just as safety and security is a prerequisite for our guests' willingness to book a cruise, they also expect that their vacation is not going to despoil the very places they want to visit and enjoy. It is in our long-term interest as an industry to protect the seas and the destinations we visit. That fact has provided the impetus behind the more than $22 billion invested so far across the industry in new technologies to protect the seas from overboard discharges and the air from stack emissions. In fact, the cruise industry has been a leader in the development and adoption of new shipboard environmental technologies. In conclusion, it's a well-worn cliche to say that safety is a journey, not a destination. Nevertheless, that is how we in CLIA view it. It's how our members view it. Safety, security, and environmental stewardship have our ongoing focused attention. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral Salerno. Next, Mr. Moilanen, you may proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the committee. First of all, I want to thank the committee for giving the American Bureau of Shipping, or ABS, the opportunity to attend this hearing today. My name is Adam Moylan, Vice President of the American Bureau of Shipping, and I cover the health, safety, and quality management system. I'd like to provide the committee an overview of ABS, of who we are and what we do. ABS is a mission-focused, not-for-profit organization dedicated to the promotion of safety for the marine and offshore industries. ABS was founded in 1862, and we are the sole American classification society. We are an organization of about 2,800 people made up of naval architects, marine engineers, and other highly technical and experienced professionals, with alumni from each state maritime academy, including the U.S. Coast Guard Academy and U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, and with a number of employees who are active reservists or retired from the U.S. Armed Services. With safety as our core value, ABS has now achieved over 3 years of zero lost time work-related injuries for our workforce. ABS has implemented an ongoing safety excellence program, as well as life safety rules, which includes a stop work obligation, authorizing all employees to intervene if safety is in question in any aspect of their work. The actual day-to-day work of ABS includes research and rule development, design review, survey during new construction of vessels and units, including the associated material and equipment, surveys during operational life of those vessels and units, and performing safety audits of companies and their vessels and units. Note that our rules are a mechanism by which we publish technical safety standards for the industry. We also publish the ABS record, which provides an up-to-date status of all vessels and offshore units that are classed with ABS. Training of our qualified workforce is supported by a centralized learning organization and ABS Academy. ABS has also delegated statutory work on behalf of 110 national flag states or countries where vessels and marine-related facilities are registered. In this capacity, ABS and other class societies are referred to as recognized organizations, or ROs. For nearly 100 years, ABS has been the official class society of the United States under the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. ABS has maintained a long and valued relationship with the U.S. Coast Guard, and along with other class societies performs delegated inspections on behalf of the U.S. Coast Guard, which includes the Alternate Compliance Program, or ACP. As stated, ABS plays an important role in marine and offshore safety, but ABS is only one component of the overall safety chain. Ship owners, crews, shipyards, equipment and material manufacturers, port states, flag states, charters, and underwriters all have vital roles as well to support the safety of the vessel, the crew, and the environment. The control environment for ABS is robust and transparent and includes an extensive internal quality management system. Over 4,000 documented policies, procedures, and work instructions guide our employees in their day-to-day work. Secondly, we conduct more than 100 internal audits of ourselves to assess the quality of our work, and there are more than 50 external audits of ABS every year. External audits are conducted by flag states, including the U.S. Coast Guard and International Association of Class Societies, or IACS, among others. Continuous improvement is an important element of our quality system, with input for change from employees, from clients, from audits, and lessons learned. Port state control, where vessels are boarded when entering port, is an external indicator of the quality of ABS service delivery. In fact, last year, ABS maintained its leading position in overall port state control performance, being one of the top performing ROs in all three of the most active regions in the world for the last three-year period from 2016 to 2018. For ABS, our objective remains the same as ever: to set standards for safety and excellence in the marine and offshore design, construction, and operation, and to verify adherence to those standards. Again, I'd like to thank the committee for its time and look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Moynihan. Next, Mr. Smith, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gibbs, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. My name is Aaron Smith, and I have the pleasure of serving as President and CEO of the Offshore Marine Service Association, or OMSA. I want to thank you for allowing me to speak here. Safety is a culture in our industry, and I am honored to be here to share with you how the domestic maritime industry not only strives to ensure that everyone goes home at the end of their hitch, but also explain how this committee can help enforce current laws that safeguard American lives, American jobs, and our national security. Mr. Chairman, my organization represents the U.S. flagged vessels and associated supply chain engaged in constructing, maintaining, and servicing offshore energy infrastructure, including the oil and gas fields of the Gulf of Mexico and increasingly the offshore wind fields of the East Coast. We represent in total 170 member companies across the United States, and we are proud to report that our collective TRI, or incident rate, is more than 2 times better than the general oil and gas production industry. OMSA has 2 complementary purposes: to increase industry safety and to ensure proper enforcement of the Jones Act, which, as this committee knows, is vital to our national, homeland, and economic security. And while the offshore energy industry continues to strive for zero incidents, our achievements could not happen without the United States Coast Guard. They serve as our regulator, but they also serve as our first responders. And we thank what this committee has done to advance legislation to ensure that our 42,000 Coast Guard men and women who protect our nation and protect our industry will never again miss a paycheck because of politics. While safety is intrinsic to our industry, the flag state laws governing United States vessels are some of the more stringent in the world. However, many of these laws are not applied to the foreign vessels operating here. The net result is the U.S. has created an unlevel playing field that favors foreign vessels and mariners doing business in our nation's own waters. As a few examples, when here, foreign vessels are not required to report the same level of incident data that we have to report to the United States Coast Guard. Additionally, foreign vessels can and do employ foreign nationals who may not follow the same safety standards as U.S. mariners and are paid a fraction of what OMSA members pay their U.S. mariners, creating a lucrative cost advantage for these vessels. Use of these mariners also causes security problems, as many are come from non-allied nations, such as Russia and China, and are issued 5-year visas with little oversight. Moreover, U.S. law requires all persons on board a U.S. flagged vessel to have a merchant mariner credential. Conversely, almost every foreign nation allows only the Marine crew to have such a license. The cost differential caused by this requirement can stretch to $1,000 per person. Outside of mariners, our industry utilizes modules to customize every vessel for each operation or contract. Regardless of complexity or risk, the Coast Guard requires U.S. flagged vessels to be subjected to lengthy plan approval and physical inspections. The cost and delays associated with this requirement, which are not enforced on foreign vessels, have directly cost OMSA members jobs and work. Considering the higher safety standard carried by U.S. flagged vessels, one of the best ways to protect mariner safety is to fully enforce the Jones Act. Unfortunately, between 1976 and 2009, Customs and Border Protection created numerous loopholes to the Jones Act, which have allowed foreign flagged vessels to transport energy equipment between U.S. points in contravention to the law and in detriment to U.S. mariners. Since 2009, CBP has openly acknowledged 3 times that they wrongly exceeded their authority. The first 2 times, CBP failed to follow through with their promised remedy. The third time came last month. In this instance, CBP also sought to revoke the so-called COF, or heavy lift rulings, where they had correctly enforced the law and prevented foreign flagged vessels from moving heavy lifts between 2 U.S. points. In place of the COF rulings, CBP has proposed legally dubious definitions, which not only allow foreign vessels to conduct all lifts in contravention to the law, but create new loopholes in the Jones Act. These definitions are outside the law and are unnecessary. This committee, in its wisdom and in its constitutional authority, has already created and passed through the House a legal, transparent, and safe ways for these heavy lifts to be conducted. The U.S. offshore industry has now been waiting for 10 years and 1 month to see the Jones Act properly enforced and put our American mariners back to work. Without proper enforcement of the Jones Act, we instead cede this work to foreign vessels which do not comply to the same safety standard as U.S. vessels. They also do not comply to the same standards we have for environmental safety or security laws. For these reasons, we hope that committee will join us in working towards correct enforcement of the Jones Act, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Ms. Stevens, you may proceed.
Thank you, and thank you, Congressman Young, for their kind introduction. It's nice to hear from a fellow Alaskan. I'm here today on behalf of the Passenger Vessel Association. It is a trade association representing the owners and operators of U.S. Coast Guard inspected vessels. Our membership has approximately 1,500 vessels, 600 business owners and businesses represented. PVA in the industry that we represent has a responsibility to be vigilant in addressing safety concerns. An essential reason for PVA's existence is to promote safety among its members and indeed among the operators of passenger vessels. To meet this responsibility, PVA develops and offers effective training programs and tools that vessel operators can easily implement. Some of these tools include preventative maintenance and guidance documents, deckhand training manuals, and video training tools on firefighting, life-saving, and other systems. PVA has its own safety management system for domestic passenger vessels. We call this Flagship. In June of 2017, the Coast Guard Director of Inspections and Compliance characterized Flagship as a remarkable achievement. That meets the objectives and functional requirements for an SMS and a voluntary program that can be accepted by the Coast Guard. All of PVA's safety products can use and be benefited smaller businesses like me or larger businesses with multiple vessels in their fleet. PVA interacts with the Coast Guard in a formal body known as the Coast Guard PVA Quality Partnership, or QP. At our most recent QP meeting, the Coast Guard headquarters last week, we discussed, among other things, what PVA has done to communicate safety information to members following the fire on the California dive boat, the Conception, who was not a PVA member. Over the years, the National Transportation Safety Board has made several recommendations to PVA, and we have responded to each of those appropriately. PVA's efforts to promote safety on passenger vessel depend on an engaged, well-trained, and adequately funded Coast Guard marine safety workforce. Coast Guard inspectors visit and rigorously examine domestic passenger vessels at least once a year. Having this direct Coast Guard presence on passenger vessels is essential and has successfully had programs for safety. In the early 2000s, as the Coast Guard made security a priority, the agency allowed the marine safety function to deteriorate. This situation became alarming enough that in 2007, this committee, under the leadership of Chairman Oberstar and Cummings, pressed the Coast Guard to reinvigorate its marine safety mission. The result was the Coast Guard's action plan entitled Enhancing the Coast Guard's Marine Safety Program. Are the action plan's objectives being met? Are the goals for the number and competence of the marine inspectors being satisfied? Some have suggested that the Coast Guard should delegate inspection functions of domestic passenger vessels to a third-party organization, as has been done for towing vessels and certain deep draft vessels. PVA animately believes that this would be a mistaken policy. It would deprive the Coast Guard marine safety personnel of the intimate knowledge of the domestic passenger fleet. Furthermore, third-party organizations do not have the expertise regarding domestic passenger vessels. Direct Coast Guard inspection of domestic passenger vessels is the best way to promote safety. In the Passenger Vessel Safety Act of 1993, Congress determined that a vessel carrying more than 6 passengers for hire must meet rigorous safety standards and be inspected by the Coast Guard at least annually. These requirements exist primarily for the safety of the paying passengers. They ensure that the vessel is constructed properly, that its master and crew have the proper documents and training, and that it has the appropriate fire protection, communications, and life-saving equipment. Far too frequently, persons with full knowledge of Coast Guard requirements try to take illegal regulatory shortcuts and make a quick buck by using an uninspected vessel to carry more than 6 passengers for hire. This is unlawful and jeopardizes the passenger safety. In my written statement, you will find details about 2 recent incidences in Florida in which passengers on illegal charters died as a result of improper training and actions by the boat crew. The problem of illegal charters has always existed, but it seems to have become much worse. It's simple to market an illegal charter to any audience on boat sharing websites. This happens all over the country. The Coast Guard has recognized the problem and has begun to crack down. PVA applauds the Coast Guard, but unfortunately, the temptation for people to engage in illegal charters is compelling that a workforce, the enforcement seems to be a constant game of whack-a-mole for them to keep up with. Thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in the hearing. PVA encourages this subcommittee to stand by the statutory and regulatory requirements for safety on vessels that carry passengers for hire. Congress can best ensure safety on domestic vessels by strongly supporting and adequately funding the Coast Guard Marine Safety Mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stevens. Mr. Sturpkow, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gibbs, and members of the committee. I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you from the perspective of an attorney who has represented those injured in marine disasters and the survivors of those who have been killed in marine disasters for 32 years. My experience and our experience dictates that safety in the marine environment is a product of accountability, pure and simple. Whether we're talking about a $100 million drill ship that sinks in the Gulf of Mexico or a jet ski that's rented at the beach, the goal must be to protect people, and that goal is only reached by holding those responsible accountable. Some examples of the law that applies to these cases that is severely lacking in our opinion is, number one, the Death on the High Seas Act. It was passed in 1920. The Death on the High Seas Act applies to marine deaths occurring more than 3 nautical miles from the coast of the United States or any territory. The act limits recovery of damages to economic losses and funeral and burial expenses. Therefore, in cases where the victim is a child, a retiree, or a stay-at-home parent, those survivors who seek redress for the death of the decedent are limited to funeral and burial expense recovery. There's no accountability. That's not protecting people. Second, and an example, actually a recent example of this that I'd like to point out to you is in August of 2017, you may recall that the USS John McCain was rammed in the Singapore Straits by a freighter. 10 sailors were killed. The sailors hailed from New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois, Ohio, Maryland, Missouri, and Texas. Unless any of these sailors were supporting others economically or had economic dependence, their survivors are limited in damage recovery to their funeral and burial expenses. There's no accountability, there's no protecting people, and in this example, we're not protecting our service people. A second example of inadequate legislation is what's known as the Limitation of Liability Act. Passed first in 1851, the act allows a vessel owner to limit its liability in cases of personal injury and death to the value of the vessel after the catastrophe. The vessel owner actually is the plaintiff in this case. The vessel owner files suit and alleges in federal court his or her ability to limit liability growing out of a marine disaster to the value of the boat following the casualty. One need only look at the conception to see the inequity, the gross inequity of this statute. 34 people burned alive in a boat within 72 hours, and before the Coast Guard had completed its investigation, the owner of the conception filed suit in federal court in California,
alleging an ability to limit its liability to the families of these 34 people to $0, the value of the vessel as she sat burned at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. It's unconscionable, there's no accountability, and it should change. A third example of inadequacies, not so much in maritime law, but in the maritime setting in terms of protecting people, is forced arbitration. Forced arbitration in maritime employment agreements and in passenger vessel boarding agreements are grossly unfair. A passenger vessel boarding agreement example that I am currently familiar with is a family from Ohio who drives down to the Alabama Gulf Coast for a week-long beach vacation. They decide to take a parasail trip. In order to board the parasail vessel, they are required to sign a boarding agreement which requires either a complete waiver of liability for any and all problems, or alternatively forced arbitration. They go parasailing. The father, the breadwinner of the family, suffers a severe injury that has disabled him and prevented him from going back to work. So this family is now faced with the prospect of either having completely waived their liability, or facing a complete waiver of liability, or in the alternative, of being forced to go to a secret arbitration proceeding where there's no accountability, and most importantly, their right to seek redress in the state or federal court system and the right, Seventh Amendment right to a jury trial is denied them. No accountability, no protecting people, and encourages, frankly, ongoing unsafe practice. In conclusion, the Death on the High Seas Act and the Limitation of Liability Act are antiquated. Forced arbitration in this maritime setting is grossly unfair. The common thread among all three is that they all protect the wrongdoer. None of them protect the people who are being injured or the survivors of those who are killed. I stand ready to address any questions and make any recommendations on these laws or other areas of the maritime legal regime, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you, Mr. Sturpkow. We will now move on to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I will start by recognizing myself. Mr. Sturpkow, in relation to the Conception tragedy off the coast of my district, how does accountability improve overall maritime safety?
Accountability, and it extends beyond the maritime setting. It's particularly important in the maritime setting because there is no incentive on the part of vessel owners and operators to ensure that their vessels are safe, they're staunch, they're seaworthy, unless there are consequences in the event that they set sail and they're not. Accountability breeds attention to detail. Accountability breeds compliance with rules and regulations. We've heard a lot today from the Coast Guard, from the Ntsb, from these various organizations who all do good work and have done good work for a long time. The problem is that despite this good work, we repeatedly see one maritime disaster after another. And the problem is that at the end of the day, if the vessel owner knows, regardless of the severity of the catastrophe, it can either limit its liability or walk away with no liability, then there's really no incentive at the end of the day to ensure that these vessels are fit for their intended purpose.
It seems to me that the Limitation of Liability Act is no longer relevant to today's maritime industry given the advances in technology and changes in the ability of insurance and the corporate structure. It has outlived its purpose. Would you agree?
I totally agree. It was originally enacted in 1851 when we were a fledgling country trying to compete in maritime commerce with European powers, at a time when boats were wooden, cargo was routinely ruined, and boats caught fire and sank in a matter of minutes. There was no modern communication. There was no ability of a vessel owner to control his ship once it left port. All of those considerations are now gone. Vessel owners can call ships, regardless of their location in the world, by cell phone, just as you and I would talk by cell phone in Washington, D.C. We track ships in real time. We know exactly where they are. We know exactly where they're going. Vessels crews are much better trained. They have safety management systems. The notion that there is an innocent vessel owner who needs to be protected from perils out of his control has long since passed, and all the limitation of Liability Act does now, in addition to eliminating accountability, is it limits the liability of the marine insurer, because none of these boats leave port without insurance. So what you're really doing is protecting the insurance industry and not the people riding the vessels.
Thank you. How do you propose we fix the law?
Limitation of liability is simple. It can be amended to eliminate the ability to limit liability in cases of injury or death. Very simple fix. You remove the problem, you increase the accountability. In terms of the Death on the High Seas Act, my recommendation would be to extend damages to include the pre-terminal pain and suffering of the person who unfortunately is the victim of a marine disaster, and extend to the survivors the right to sue for what we typically call wrongful death damages. Those are damages for say if a child is killed, the parents of that child cannot sue at this point for their losses, for their emotional distress, loss of care, comfort, and companionship. The parents and the survivors of decedents in this situation should be permitted to recover those damages. And by the way, there is precedent for this. In 1996, Congress carved out what's called the commercial aviation exception to the Death on the High Seas Act following the TW-800 disaster. If you remember, it went into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Long Island, and a group of students from Pennsylvania were killed. And when their parents learned that their recovery in that case was limited to funeral and burial expenses, it created a situation that ultimately made its way to Congress, which ultimately led to what's called the commercial aviation exception, which allows parents to recover their damages for the loss of a child in the limited case of a commercial aviation disaster more than 12 miles off the coast. My fix is very simple. Extend that to all disasters falling under DOSHA. There's no reason to treat a plane disaster different than a boat disaster. And after all, the vast majority of these cases involve vessels and not airplanes.
Thank you very much for that thorough answer. Now we'll go to, I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, in your written testimony, talk about safety, how U.S. flag vessels carry a higher standard of safety and security than foreign flag vessels. And you go on to say that if we fully enforce the Jones Act, that would enhance that. But as it relates to, we're not enforcing offshore energy. Can you expound on that? Explain what's really going on so I can understand that better?
Yes, sir. Starting in 1976, Customs and Border Protection started issuing kind of private correspondence to charters. They would request a determination if a certain activity violated the Jones Act or not. CBP would respond with a letter saying, yes, it did, yes, it did not. In approximately 160 of these letter rulings, Customs provided basically loopholes to the Jones Act that are not found in statute. These were concepts based on, well, the vessel was only moving a small amount of cargo or was only moving cargo a small distance. Therefore, they were doing something legal, so they should also be able to do something illegal simultaneously. As I said, none of these exceptions are found in law. That's something that, as I said in my testimony, CBP has recognized 3 times now and has tried to revoke those letter rulings, has tried to close those loopholes. 2 times, after announcing their intention to do so, they have backtracked and said, no, we're not going to do that at this time. In fact, in 2009, when they retracted that, they said, we will get back to this in the near future. In 2017, they said, we received a lot of emails, so we need to study this. I didn't know you could not enforce the law because you got a lot of emails. I'm sure that would change how your office operates, sir. So they have now again said, we want to correctly enforce the law. Unfortunately, in doing so, they have also issued some new definitions which we believe create new loopholes to replace the old loopholes they're trying to close. It's probably not the best of situations.
I was also, I guess, to kind of follow up kind of idea. I know LNG, we're exporting LNG now. We're the largest producer in the world of natural gas and oil. And my understanding is, because we pick up LNG shipments in the Gulf area, and then they export to other countries. But then to get LNG in needed areas of the country, like in our New England area, for example, they have to get it in from the foreign. What can we do to adjust, fix it? How can we handle that so Americans can, burn LNG, natural gas, the domestically produced LNG, natural gas?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Gibbs. The American maritime industry is willing to meet any challenge. And in fact, what we're best at is overbuilding a market. If you give us the signals that a market will be protected, we're probably going to build too many ships for it. And with these signals now that LNG is going to be protected by this administration, what we're seeing is even the European trade magazines are already saying that there's going to be U.S. LNG capacity. One of my members just launched an ATB, an articulated tug and barge, to transport LNG. And I know that they can take that design and are taking that design to produce more of those so we can have that. It is my understanding, although this isn't necessarily exactly what we do on a day-to-day basis, but it's my understanding that we are right now basically at the export. There is no extra capacity in the export terminals. Once there is, we will have the vessels capable to carry that.
That's good. That's good to know, because it just makes so much sense to do that. And plus, our U.S. flagged vessels would be safer, probably theoretically, anyways, than other ones, especially carrying LNG. So glad to hear that, because I think that makes a lot of sense. We need to do that and open up the market, because we need to move as much as we can out of the Permian Basin in Texas, and of course the Dakotas, and also we produce a lot of natural gas in Ohio and Pennsylvania. So it'd be great to be able to export as much as we can on American vessels. Glad to hear that. You think we can
completely agree, Ranking Member Gibbs. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Gibbs. I think that pretty much concludes our hearing. Are there any further questions from members of the subcommittee? Seeing none, I would like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony today. Your contributions to today's discussion have been informative and helpful. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. And unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. If no other member has anything to add, the subcommittee stands adjourned.